So we have the planter class Democrats taking power. They unified, kind of allied themselves with their old Republicans. So, do we get this at all right here? All right, so how do you deal with this second class citizenship? Well, there's two main paths. It would be personified by two brilliant men who Booker T. Washington was a little bit older, but really shows the problem. When you go to by 1900, this was the most racist time in American world history. About 1900, even more than slavery, which is almost impossible to imagine, but it's true. And how do you deal with the fact that both political parties were becoming more and more hostile to equal rights? The Democrats were so split over this, so Southern Democrats were all against it, equal rights, and the Republican Party was becoming more that way. So the first idea would form around this man right here, Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave. And he gave, at a speech to mostly black men about rights in Atlanta, he said, we must emphasize economics over equality, except for now, the Jim Crow laws, but try to build an economic base. The problem was Jim Crow laws, by definition, kept people out of the basic dealings of capitalism. Don't forget, it's more than just simply saying they'll have a white-only restaurant. It is saying that certain people are going to be an economic underclass, a permanent economic underclass, and cannot participate in capitalism. So it's already, there's a flaw to the Atlanta plan. Try to get better jobs and make money in a situation that's geared or rigged against them. And then WB, okay, it should be Du Bois, but this is America, and everybody always called him Du Bois. It's Webb Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois. And William Du Bois, right here. Brilliant man, brilliant writer. His history of Reconstruction is absolutely fantastic. But he looked at it differently. There's no way there can be any kind of economic system unless we have equal rights. Got to have equal rights. And that means political rights. So while Booker T. Washington is saying accept the political situation, Du Bois is saying we need political rights. We need to get not only allies elected, but ourselves elected. We need to get in government because government makes the rules. Jim Crow, that's government. Segregation, government laws. What was the court case that's a separate but equal? I forgot to ask them. Yeah, Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, Supreme Court justices are political appointments. We need our people in there. And those are going to be the 2 points of view. He will be one of the co-founders of an organization that would fight tirelessly for equal rights called the NAACP. Now, it's kind of very awkward, the NAACP, because of the abbreviation. So today, people just simply still call it the NAACP because it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And so it's a very awkward way of saying it. It really shows that it's from around 1900, 1907. But as long as you get down, the NAACP would be a tireless fighter for equal rights. It would be the NAACP that would bring up the court case that would lead to Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. So it's important to understand that was his roots. He's going to be a tireless fighter for equal rights for men and women. He will try to go to the treaty negotiations in Paris after World War I to get independence for African colonies. He, of course, would not be listened to and would be a tireless fighter. Let me ask you a question. Which one of those two men is going to be invited to the White House? Yeah, Booker T. Washington. He will be invited to Teddy Roosevelt's White House. Teddy Roosevelt was a great believer in something we'll get to called eugenics. That would start in the United States and then spread. But yeah, it would be Booker T, not W.B. Du Bois. Because he's saying avoid the wig. And this might undermine the situation. That is somebody, which one of these two would be more for the Fusion Party? Yeah, Du Bois. Du Bois. For the Fusion Party. I can't comprehend. I can't. I can guess. I've read about what Booker T. Washington had to go through with the situation, how racist it was at that time, of how to deal with that. So I have sympathy for that, but I do greatly admire Du Bois. So this will be the most racist time in history. Nadir of racism meaning the height of racism. And partially because now you have people who are now independent in this way to crack back at that and keep economic control. Remember, what did Jim Crow laws do to wages for everybody? Drops them. What does prison labor do to wages? Drops them. I should add, almost forgot something. So, I was talking about how tough it is for prisoners, and many of them are the firefighters right now in LA. But as bad as it is for them making in between $6 and $20 a day in a terrible job, still better than being in prisons. I just heard some interviews with them about that. I'm just happy not to be in prison anymore, even though they're basically slaves. Tells you a lot about prison, huh? So, and one of the symbols of this will be a lynching. And lynchings will almost always be a black man. And this is not just an attack on one individual. This is a warning to everybody else. And it's going to be for lots of reasons. Voting, it's also going to be for perceived crimes, but the biggest one would be accusations of rapes of white women. That would be the biggest thing. In fact, any kind of interracial relationship, especially between black men and white women. The black men say this like this. And I forgot to add something for Jim Crow for you guys. So turn back to Jim Crow. One more thing I forgot to add. And I did for other ones. It's one of the things I know I would get to it, but then I start talking about the economics. Interracial marriage would be banned in almost every state in 40 states. Interracial marriage. It was, of course, banned. And this is kind of a big deal. Most of them have basically, they took what made someone a slave from slavery, remember the fornication laws, and expanded on it. So Virginia would be the norm. They would say there'd be no interracial marriage, and what made someone who was black, the law was called the one-drop law. One drop. If you have one ancestor anywhere in your background of African descent, you're black. That's what it would be. So when in Nazi Germany, in fact, right after Hitler took power, the story how he took power, but took power, Nazi lawyers, we looked at it in America about Jim Crow laws, and they admired a lot about what the United States would do about basically trying to divide Germany out of this. But they looked at laws like the one-drop law and said, that's impossible, that's too much. Which is kind of an interesting thing. It's like, well, yeah, we're too much for Nazi Germany. So back to this. One of the symbols would be lynching, and this one, justice is about rape. That one, look at the crowd posing in their Sunday best, in their ties to watch somebody be lynched. Remember, lynching is torturing somebody to death. Most of the time we hear lynching, we think of hanging. That's usually involved, but it's a torture to death. And it's extrajudicial. Even though law enforcement would be involved always, it was not from a trial. It was just vigilante justice. So no justice in reality. And how many people are going to be arrested for these lynchings? Nobody. Now, the federal government has, by the 14th Amendment, some authority in this. But there would be a movement for anti-lynching laws from the NAACP from the turn of the century. For years, they would fight for an anti-lynching law. There is a federal anti-lynching law now. Anybody want to guess the president who signed the anti-lynching law? Want to take a guess? Anyone? Guess? He's still president. Joe Biden. That's how long it took. So this is compiled by the NAACP, and the numbers are vague because what is a lynching? What is a murder? There's a lot in Montana. Utah, it was pretty well hidden, but it did happen there. And you can see the areas, the darker the color, the more lynchings. But it's also the greatest population of African Americans too. And so those are, it's a time when I had to do it all by hand, the map. And here's a couple ones. That's one, a couple more. I don't need to explain the one on the right. I think that's pretty sums up about the voting rights. And then the one on the left, you see what that is? So that was a man who's lynched. Then they set the body on fire while it was hanging. And then you see the back of it. They turned it into one of these new things, fangled things that was created at the turn of the last century called a postcard. So they can send it. So you can remember it and send it to your friends. It's just horrific. And that would become one of the symbols of this era. But the whole point is terror. Terror. Don't act up or this could happen to you. And there were lynchings, as you can see, all over the United States. And it coincides with another view of the Civil War called the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause was saying the Civil War was actually a noble fight. It was not about slavery. It was a noble fight to defend Southern states. Slavery had nothing to do with it. Oh, sure, maybe a little bit in the periphery. But it was about states' rights to defend against Northern tyranny, Northern aggression. And that is why you get people with Subi saying going into the 20th century that it was fought about Northern bullying in Congress, about Northern industrialists wanting to have a tariff. We just heard someone say the Civil War was about tariffs. What? That would have been a shock to the people in 1861. And lastly, it would be in the 1890s as part of this lost cause when people started referring to this war as the war between the states. That became so prevalent. I was actually corrected by my junior American history teacher, who I loved, Mr. Blecky, a great teacher. I adored him as a teacher in a lot of ways. He was a good teacher. But I remember I said the Civil War, and he said, well, more properly, during the war, they called it the war between the states. Because he had been taught in this lost cause thing. No, during the Civil War, they called it the Civil War or the War of Rebellion. Those are the two things they called it. Nobody called it the war between the states. And remember I told you the story about Shiloh, where they called it the war between the states and they cheered, and the war of Northern aggression and the war of Northern arrogance. That became part of the lost cause. And that's when you start seeing monuments being built in the 1890s. The Confederate battle flag would become a symbol. One of the most popular songs in the South after the war was I'm a Good Old Rebel, which is actually kind of a catchy little tune, but it's about I will not be reconstructed. And states' rights became the equal. Remember, before the Civil War, states' rights meant pro-slavery. After the Civil War, it meant lost cause and pro-Jim Crow. And so pro-Jim Crow, that means anti-civil rights. And so these are two pictures. This is one in Georgia in 68. This is the Selma to Montgomery March in 65, which we will talk about. Big deal. But protesters to these rights, they're both for registration to vote and for voting rights in general. And what would counter protesters do? Wave the Confederate battle flag. If you have the Confederate battle flag today, you're making a statement about yourself. You want people to think something about you. And a lot of this legacy comes from there. Hey, we all do. We want people to think something about us, how we dress, how we act. People want you to think something about them with this Confederate battle flag. And they might say, oh, it looks like I'm going to be a rebel. But they want you to think something, even if they don't even know what that is. And so that Confederate battle flag became a symbol of the lost cause, of anti-civil rights approaching. Remember the Confederate monuments. And so you'll see this to this day. And one of the more ironic shots of this, I think I have this in the next one here. Oh, they also start revising history. And you start seeing this in these brand new textbooks. Now we have public education is more ingrained, and start seeing it in textbooks where they're going to be teaching the lost cause. That's why I do have sympathy for Mr. Ledke, even though there's some issues with him. Still was a good teacher, but this is what he was taught. In fact, most people are taught this, the lost cause element of history. So that is from a textbook from the 1970s, and it says how Negroes lived under slavery, and it talked about they made laws closely controlling the Negroes. However, the laws were not fully enforced. Many slave masters like the government telling them what to do. They managed their servants under their own method. The Negroes were taught to read and write. Many of them were allowed to meet in groups for preaching, for funerals, and for singing and dancing. They even had guns. And that's one of those. What? So they're downgrading slavery so they can say it's another reason for the war. Here's another one. This is a map, and this is a little bit a future text, but a little bit after this one, and it's showing immigration. And it has immigrants here, and those are people of African descent. And it says the African slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa, just workers, they had a job, to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. Doesn't sound bad at all. You're just a worker, right? That doesn't whitewash at all what happened, does it? Anybody want to guess when this textbook came out? When? 2022. Yeah, so there's an issue about teaching this. Thank you, Texas. Yeah, this is for Texas. The state of Texas, the state buys the textbooks for every school in the state. So that means Texas is a massive market. And Texas does not like anybody to say bad things about it. So, if you have this massive market buying books and you have to have stuff like that, it's cheaper for the textbook companies to basically just sell all this books here. Get my point there? Texas is such a big market, they can kind of dominate that. Yeah, that's just 2022. The current U.S. history textbook that other classes use, I have other classes, it hints at this, yeah. Our textbook is better, but there's issues. So that's why you have people like this waving the Confederate flag. And anybody know what little event this is? That's the January 6th insurrection. And they stormed the U.S. Capitol, killing 6 people, 5 police officers were killed, which I guess now is perfectly okay. But many were carrying the Confederate battle flag. You know what the statue they're on? Anyone know? That's the statue of Grant. That's Grant's statue in front of the U.S. Capitol. Grant's just behind her to the left. So the strange irony of what happened. And so this is where you get this kind of tradition with this, and also startling. So we have the Reconstruction. And the Reconstruction myth then would come out of this. If the lost cause in the war was a noble fight for freedom, that means there was no reason for Reconstruction. If there's no reason for Reconstruction, that must mean it was a northern invasion. And if the plan was to bring black misrule, to punish the Southerners. That shows you how evil the North was. So it wasn't about rights, it was to punish white Southerners. And you can imagine what's going on. The planter class that's taken over is really going to push that to get then people who might maybe join the Fusion Party to join with them. And this will become prevalent with the lost cause. And there'll be a series of books. But this, in 1913, one of the most popular books from 4 years earlier would be turned into a movie called The Birth of the Nation. And The Birth of the Nation by D.W. Griffith, in many ways, it kind of invented movies. He was a brilliant filmmaker. And so much of motion picture making would come from D.W. Griffith. But the style of long movies about narration, the way they would center shots in film would be invented by D.W. Griffith, a brilliant filmmaker who would base this book on a book called, what was the name? See if you can guess where this name comes from. The Klansman. And the hero of this book, The Birth of the Nation, is the Southern victory over Reconstruction. The Southern victory, and the Klan was the hero. The Klan came in and stopped the evil North and black misrule. So on the right is an example of a carpetbagger, and it's a white man in blackface. This comes from the minstrel shows mocking African Americans right here. It was very common in early motion pictures that white people playing everybody. And here, The Klan's coming in and stopping the evil Reconstruction. And there's the Klan, the heroes. Now, for people who are like me, who really dislike things like the Ku Klux Klan, despise them, I take some solace in how he does the Klan. Maybe you see it? You see it? Doesn't it look like they're all wearing plungers on their head? So I take a little bit of solace in their bunch of plunger heads. Woodrow Wilson was president of the United States. He was an historian, born in Virginia, but he taught at Princeton in New Jersey. And in one of the books he wrote about American history, about the American South, he added this and included it in one of the frames of Birth of the Nation. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation. And so at last there sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. And that was the sitting president of the United States. Wilson's a complex man. But this movie was such a big deal, it's hard to even describe. Guess what came into existence after this movie? Or let me rephrase that, made a return. The Klan. So please write that down. The Klan came back, the second version. Now, this is a more openly racist to not just African Americans, but basically racist to anybody who is not of Northern European descent, but also prejudice against Jews, prejudice against Mormons, Orthodox Christians. There's a very small population of Muslims, but them too. And this would help trigger a wave of Confederate monuments. So there are a bunch of Confederate monuments that would begin when Jim Crow was established and the final redemption, 1890s. But they became symbols of the lost cause. So there's going to be a lot of, here's Grant, or here's Lee in Charlottesburg, Virginia. Here is Lee Circle in Richmond, Virginia. And this is right along Confederate Lane. There's going to be a whole road of Confederate heroes like Stonewall Jackson and John Gordon and Braxton Bragg, etc. All these, he was an idiot, but yeah, the statue. And these were done on purpose, not just to memorialize the lost cause, but also they would do these like in Richmond. Monument Row is right along the road, the edge of a segregated neighborhood. On the other side was a segregated black neighborhood. So every single time someone would leave that neighborhood, they would have to pass a bunch of things. That was done as a slap in the face. So they're not remembering the war. And monuments are always for this reason. Monuments are to reinforce your vision of the past to help you today. Thomas Francis Meagher was not put up for what Meagher did in front of the Capitol. It was a slap in the face to the vigilantes and all the Irish immigrants coming into Butte. That's basically what it was. That's why they put Meagher. And also to say that the Democratic Party was strong in Montana. So, Confederate monuments. And so there's another one, a Lee, and this one's in North Carolina. Here's the putting up a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest in Tennessee. And here's Nathan Bedford Forrest in the state capital of Tennessee. I chose Forrest on purpose because Forrest would be the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. This will be taken out 2 years. The statue of Forrest. And so all these statues would appear. In fact, this is pretty shocking. These are all the Confederate monuments. And the big stars, Jim Crow, and the big height, huge height, Birth of a Nation. And then you'll notice another big increase, anti-civil rights. Also in a bunch of Confederate monuments appeared. Basically, one bigger than Mount Rushmore. A carving in Georgia will be Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and Robert E. Lee. It's bigger than Mount Rushmore. And that would be completed in Georgia in 76. It's huge. So, including that one would come about because of Birth of the Nation. You know what that is? Where? Yeah, that was in Women's Park in Helena. Helena, Montana had the furthest north public Confederate statue. And it was taken out 6 years. 6 years. Now it's at Orb, which really the orb it's kind of cool, but it doesn't quite fit in with the base. But what the heck, right? Why? Birth of the Nation. They literally started talking about this with Birth of the Nation. And also there's Klan meetings in Helena. I should add there weren't very many African Americans. Their target were Chinese. 1/10 of the population of Helena in 1913 were of Chinese descent. By 1920, it was less than 1%. That would be the target. So this is one of the more interesting ones. This is a Confederate monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest in Nashville, Tennessee. At least it was. And when I first saw this, I thought this had to be a joke, right? No, this was meant to be pro Nathan Bedford Forrest. They finally took it out because every day, every week, it would be covered with red paint. Someone comes through, roll red paint, they clean it off, they throw it again. So now it's in, well, it's in the richest man in Tennessee's backyard. So, Gone with the Wind would be, Gone with the Wind, this myth would be the reconstruction. And I mentioned this once before. Who watched Gone with the Wind in here? A couple people did? Anyone know it in here? I had about 5 people watch Gone with the Wind in my 4 classes. It is a good movie, but it's all about the heroes are the plantation owners. Slaves they love slavery and will defend their masters and mistresses. The enemies are Union soldiers. This is one of the opening scroll they had. Here's a pretty world where gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and slave. Doesn't mean it's not a good movie. Special Topics week, 2 years ago, we watched Birth of the Nation. Class really liked it, but silent movies are hard for us to watch just because, we don't, they have to overact because there's no sound. They're just weird. I recommend it. In fact, the second scariest movie I've ever seen is a silent. They just did a remake of it. Nosferatu. Scary. Sundown Towns, last thing for today. It took me longer than I thought, but what the heck, right? It's kind of a big deal. So what's going to happen in cities outside of the South? We had a tiny population of African Americans. We can imagine a lot of African Americans trying to escape sharecropping, trying to escape the Jim Crow laws. But when they would go north, even people said, "Oh, we don't like slavery. Equal rights are fine, but we want to keep our white neighborhood." They'll say things like traditional values. Sundown towns would be on medium to small towns all over the rest of the United States outside the South. And I think this pretty much sums it up. This was a town. This is a city in Illinois. They would pass city ordinances that say anybody who is not white would be arrested in town, especially if they were black. Another one would be Hispanic, would be others. Just to get the point. There were 12 sundown towns in Montana. There were over 10,000 in the United States. My dad, already mentioned him once before, who was born on the sharecropper's farm. When they moved to a little town called Louisville, Nebraska, south of Omaha, it was a sundown town. That sign going into town, and I know exactly where it was because I've driven there many times. My grandparents lived there, where it said no blank out. And when he was 8, during World War II, there was a crew working on the Rock Island Railroad, and there were a number of workers, some were all kinds of people, but a few of the black and Hispanic men were in the group. They stayed in town after dark, and he grabbed them, roughed them up, and took one man and lynched him. They sawed him in half on a barbed wire fence. That was the town. That was the reality. He only heard about it. It's one of those things. I don't even want to think about that, but I want you to know one more thing. The Klan was big. His grandpa on the other side of the sharecropping farm, his dad, his grandpa, get my people right. The Klan burned a cross in his front yard. 1943. They thought he was a Jew or a Muslim. They burned a cross in his front yard. He still remembers the cross. Your dad? In his grandma's. Yeah, but they went to Sunday dinner and they said he remember stepping over the cross. Oh, I should add, my great grandfather scared off the Klan with a shotgun. Yeah. Yeah. And it's little things that my dad wouldn't tell me these stories until I was much older. All right, clear out, people. I've had enough of you. Until tomorrow, then I'll be so happy to see you. I'll be so happy. Have a good day, everybody. And right when you find work. Oh, so you're basically ready. And so I just got to put, now, what is it the Senate page program nonsense? Senate. You're going to Cascade. Oh, let me look at it again. Yeah. I thought I did, but then I think I did one of those where I looked at it, then set it down. But I think they weren't wrong. I'll find it again. I looked at it and everything, and that was well, this right.
Yeah.
So I can get it out. And look at it one more time. Okay? I promise I'll do it. I know. I'm gonna start. All the rules. A lot. I did. And so make sure you go through those for summary, give it out. Whatever.
I did, but yeah, from last time we checked, I think everything's good. And the shoes
So
that I
pick someone you don't know. And I'll also say, don't worry about it. Now, you, so.
You're doing something, but so I know my stuff. I'm going to go around it. Come back.
Quick.
Yes, I have passed. It's just.
Hey, I'm pretty sure Stan Donald playing Luigi last time we saw. And his O line was terrible. His O line couldn't block a span call.
You're not, but